almost any type of report, but especially with a summary. One is adding the data date timestamp. The other is how to organize your summary information. The other is aligning column headers with your summary information, and then shading different groups to allow the eye to follow the data a little easier. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but these are a few tips that I find useful over the years. In this modified and cleaned up version to kind of guide us through some of these principles and show you how they're done. Notice I have my data date and data time. This helps me realize when the report was run and serve as a point of reference. Obviously, if you run a report halfway through the month and then at the end of the month, there will probably be some differences. Unless, of course, we're talking historical data. But it's always good to have the data date and data time to let you know if something happened, you can kind of pinpoint it and explain any differences. Also, I have my report title, then I have my shading, and then I have my placement. Let's start with the data date, data time. Go ahead to our design view and let's highlight this field. In its raw form, just inserting a data date and data time inserts a time and a date stamp. But it's often useful to know exactly what date you are actually looking at. In this case, go ahead and click on the Insert menu and choose the first option, which is Text Object. Notice how the mouse turns into little crosshairs. Go ahead and click and hold down and drag the mouse over to as much space as you think you'll need. Then, in the blinking cursor, type in data, date, /time, and another space. Now the actual look is really up to you, but I find it helpful to know exactly what data, date, and time I'm looking at and have it labeled just in case I have a whole bunch of other dates I need to analyze on my screen as well. From here we go to View and go to our Field Explorer. If you haven't already, go ahead and uncollapse these fields. Choose Data Date, click and hold the mouse down. I'm going to drag it over into Report Header B, and notice I have my highlighted selection box. But if I drag it up into this section, it disappears and is replaced with a blinking cursor. If I release my mouse button now, my data date will appear within the text box that I've created. That means wherever I move it or resize it, it stays in one place. I don't have to move each field individually. Although you could set it up individually, it's all a matter of taste. Go ahead and double click inside that text box. And notice I have my blinking cursor again. I can use my arrow keys to move the cursor, but watch what happens when I get to data date. It skips around it. It doesn't treat data date as a text. Inside those brackets, it's a separate field. It basically treats it like one letter. If you delete it, it'll delete the whole thing. In this case, I'm just going to put it towards the end. Space, dash, and space, and then I'm actually go straight back to my Field Explorer, click and hold down on data time, and drag my mouse back. Notice how my box disappeared and it's replaced with that blinking cursor. If I release, my data date and data time now appear within my text box. It's a little trick, but it comes in handy and saves you a lot of headache and heartache and ulcers sometimes. Now if I click on my Preview tab, this is what I get. Go ahead and close Field Explorer so we can see. Now I have my data date and data time and it's properly labeled, so I know that I'm not making a mistake. The next thing I like to harp on, if you will, is using this summary information and then pulling it onto the report. For example, this field here, if I drag my mouse over, I get my little text tab. It says Report Title String. As we know from prior lessons, if I go to my File, Summary Info, it brings up my Document Properties window. And this is where I add in who the author is, what any keywords are. That helps if you're searching, if it comes down to it. And also comments. Now these comments can be as lengthy and long-winded as you like, and I find they're very helpful. Sometimes it reminds me why I created a report or if I had to do something special to it. Not only that, I can pull in these comments if I felt like it underneath the report title to remind the users, the final users of the report, what they're looking at. Of course, that's no guarantee that they'll call me up and ask me to basically read them what's on the same report, but that's life. The point is, if I hadn't have filled it in here, I wouldn't have been able to display it here and drag it onto the report and resize it and do all those things. The next main thing I like to do, especially when I'm dealing with groups of data, is to highlight kind of main groups, so that way the eye has something to follow. In this case, I have each year broken out since 1999, but I have my East and West grayed out so my eye can follow a little bit easier. If you recall, you simply right-click on the group header one from either the Preview or the Design tab, say Section Expert, click on the Color tab, and then choose the color of your choice. Beauty being in the eye of the beholder, you can choose whatever color you see fit. I found in my experience though, not everyone agrees with my color schemes as they were. And also, if things are being transmitted electronically, you really have to pay attention to what colors you choose, because colors on one monitor that look fine can be absolutely horrendous and annoying on another. From there, it was just a simple matter of making sure my sections were uniform in the same size. That way, the eye doesn't have too far to stray to go from one level to the next. You can also highlight or underline or put borders around things to draw attention to them and allow the eye to fall a little bit easier. There's a few extra tips if you're dealing with a detail report, which we'll get into shortly. Report. This is a report that has a lot of detail for users to go through. These are often referred to as operational reports because of the level of detail required. Again, I'd like to reiterate the importance of a data, date, and timestamp, especially if you're dealing with a real-time environment where things change from day to day, hour to hour, or in some cases, second to second. Also, even though it's a detailed report, it helps to have summary information based on the different groupings. Another important piece are the column headings and the detail alignment. You also have the ability to choose the multi-section detail presentation, and then we have a phenomenon known as TMI, which is too much information on a single page. And then of course we have the export options to consider. I like to call it to print or not to print. Continuing, which is basically our report 2 but cleaned up. This is in its summary version. What we're going to do is add the detail back. In this case, let's go to Design View, and I'm going to go ahead and delete Group Section 2, and I'm going to unsuppress Group 2. Group Header 2, as you know, is our office name group. Then I'm going to go ahead and kind of line that up over here. Next, I'm going to go to my detail section, and I'm going to show it, i.e. unsuppress it. Now, if I click on my Preview tab, I have my East blocked out, I have my Charlotte office, and then all the detail associated with Charlotte. The important thing here is to align the data so it makes sense. Now, we already have our data date, our data time, we have our title, and Crystal does a good job of lining up our column headings, but it doesn't help us follow the data, especially if you have to deal with all those details. So what I'm going to go back to my Design tab. I'm going to right-click in the Detail section and select all section objects. Next, I'm going to format these objects, and I'm going to go to Border. And I need a single left line and press OK. Then I go back to my Preview tab. Then I'm going to click outside there, and notice now I have a line that helps me follow the columns and line them up nicely. In fact, I can make a semi-grid out of this if I wanted to. I go back to my details and say select all section objects again, right click, format objects, and let's go back to the border. And on the bottom I want to put a single line as well, and then click on Preview. Now if I click outside, now I have something that helps my eyes follow it, almost like Excel, a nice little grid that's easy to read and follow. Especially if you have to print these out, these come in handy to add those things. Now, some people like a left-handed line or a complete box or complete grid to work with. It really depends on the end user. I find this helpful with detailed reports because whether you export it or you print it, the human eye has a hard time following things that aren't completely lined up and organized, and a line really helps you get past that. Again, I can't stress enough the importance of the data date and data time, so I'll get up on the soapbox one more time. If you're beginning these reports, I highly suggest you insert the data date and data time. There are other options you can also use to help people read the data a little bit better. You can use shading, for example. Now, it's a little advanced, but once we get into formulas, you can get a formula that will allow you to shade every other line a different color, like gray, white, gray, white. That also helps you follow. Next, go back to Design View. You can also right-click on the Detail section and insert a section below. Now what this will do is it will stick a blank line as it stands underneath every single detail line we have on the report. So if I click on Preview, notice what happens. Beauty, or functionality, in this case, is in the eye of the beholder. A lot depends on how this report is intended to be used. As far as detail goes, presenting it is always kind of a toss-up. Some users like having spaces. Some like it all compacted into a nice grid. It really is going to depend on the specifics that they're asking to see. This is also a good place to introduce what I like to call TMI. Now, if you insert a section below in the details, you can actually stick in more data as you see fit. For example, in database fields, I can go to my revenue transaction table. I can bring in my product number, my client number. Scoot this over a little bit. I can bring in my type. Basically, anything that's available to me. Go ahead and close this. Now if I click on the Preview tab, notice what happens next. Now underneath my original data line, I have yet more data. This is another option. If you especially have large amounts of data that won't fit on one line, you can stick a line below and add. But you have to be careful. This is where we get into the TMI effect. It becomes harder to read and harder to follow. Now you can also put it into a grid and a group and do some things to make it easy if absolutely necessary. But again, the more you stick on the report, the harder it is to read.